Hi, welcome back to CyberX's Canadian Women in Cybersecurity Conference. My name is Coode, and today I am here to talk to you about Canada's marvelous privacy regulations. And because I loved a themed presentation today, I am going to be talking to you about privacy in the theme of Marvel. And if you don't like Marvel, that's fine. Just consider it a really insightful presentation with a lot of colorful pictures. And if you do like Marvel, then enjoy. So every good superhero needs a good origin story. So here's mine. I was in engineering at the University of Waterloo. I did a combination degree in electrical and computer engineering because I wanted to make video phones. So not surprisingly, I ended up at BlackBerry. BlackBerry was RIM at the time, and of course we were the original phone makers. But what happened at BlackBerry that in the time that I was there in the early 2000s was it was when the iPhone had first come about. And I watched people looking at the BlackBerry that had been privacy and secure focused and perfect for companies. And I watched them replacing it with the iPhone. And at the time, a lot of people still ask, they're like, what was the downfall of BlackBerry? The real downfall of BlackBerry was that it couldn't do the cool stuff that iPhone could do. But the reason it couldn't do that cool stuff was because we didn't allow external applications to reach into your private information. BlackBerry had protected contacts and schedules and calendars, and because of that, we were not allowing these apps to interact with your private data. When I left BlackBerry, I actually got to start my own company called Binary Tattoo, and my mission was to help educate people about how these digital devices were using all of their private data. Because I had seen this happen with BlackBerry and the interest in iPhone, I knew that people didn't care about their privacy because they didn't understand it. And that's where I wanted to help them. With the advent of GDPR and all of these new privacy regulations that we've heard talked about in the last few years, I did a certification in Canadian privacy law. And I was also part of the Standards Council of Canada for GDPR in order to help people better understand privacy. So a lot of people ask me, what is the difference between security and privacy? So security is what protects your assets. Security is your firewall and all of your access control, and it keeps your intruders out. But the thing with security and cybersecurity is that if somebody gets into your organization, whether that's physically or technologically into your organization, it's not necessary that they've caused damage in that organization. It's possible they get in and you kick them out before they do any damage. It's possible they get in and cause a lot of damage, but the security is there to keep the intruders away. Where privacy is your confidential data and secrets. Once private data is out, you cannot take it back. So we know Peter Parker is Spider-Man, and once you know that, you cannot unknow it. And that is why privacy has higher standards and regulations that we need to obey, because like security, again, once that private information has been released, we cannot give it back to the individuals that it affects. The problem that we've had in the past is innovation over consequence. And I'm coming from the startup world. I live in Waterloo, in Canada, where we have a lot of startup companies. And we have this notion of feeling fast and moving on. We tell tech companies all the time, make the product, get it out there, try it out, see if it works. And if it doesn't, scrap it, go on to the next product. But what we've done with this fail fast and move on is we haven't actually taken time to consider what we should be doing with the product in order to avoid the consequences. And then you'll hear all about, certainly this week in this conference, but all over the place right now, that with COVID, we have this forced digital transformation. So we are forcing companies to become digital that were not previously digital. And one of the biggest companies that we can see this happening to certainly is healthcare, where we always obviously had in-person healthcare with its visits and comments and notes. Now we have virtual healthcare. So what we're seeing now is companies coming online to provide virtual services that had never been provided in real life before. And they're coming on so quickly, they're not taking time to consider the consequences of what those services could be happening with the services with the privacy of the data that they're handling. We have other legislations in the world, and there's certainly some that you've heard of. The US privacy legislations are very innovation first. There's very minimal limitation on what you can do with the data. So they like to just kind of move forward. They like to just do whatever it is that they want to do for innovation. And unfortunately, the prime with this one is social media. We look at Facebook, we look at Google. The implementation of those things were put in place before people were considering what was actually happening with that data. There are some exceptions with US privacy legislations. You've probably heard of CCPA, that is for residents of California. That came out in January of 2020 last year. There are many new legislations coming out. Virginia actually just passed one, and California has a variation on CCPA, which is CCPRA, which is coming January of 2023. And all of these legislations are putting a little bit more users ahead of this innovation. But considering, again, that in the past, the privacy legislations were how forward thinking can we be in the technology we create, and now not how much can we protect the individuals. In the EU, we launched GDPR. GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. It covers all individuals and all corporations inside the EU. And it came out in effect as of May 2018. I love the GDPR. There's mixed reviews on GDPR because, again, it's not an innovation first regulation. GDPR protects the people. GDPR's purpose is to put individuals first. So the Facebooks of the world, of course, are having a lot of difficulty with GDPR because their entire model is around how much data can I collect and how much data can I sell. Where GDPR stops and says, hold on a second, you can only collect data if you require it. You can only collect data if you've asked permission to get it. You can only do a limited amount of things with the data. So it's quite restrictive. And the other thing is, often people will say to me, why should I even bother? And the superhero version of me, of course, says, because it's the right thing to do. Privacy is the right thing to do. It's right to protect the individuals that you are looking after. It's right to protect privacy. But for companies that have always just made money and don't really care about the individuals, GDPR was one of the first regulations that came out with fines for non-compliance. And those fines are really high. And if you just Google fines GDPR, you will see them up in the tens of millions of dollars for big companies where they have breached what this regulation has set out. So if it doesn't put you in the right frame of mind to just say, hey, you need to go do this because it's right, then, hey, you're going to do this because if you don't, you're going to lose a lot of money. So in Canada, we have a number of privacy regulations. So we're going from GDPR that covers all of the European Union to Canada, which is a little bit of a hodgepodge. So the first one we have is the Privacy Act. And the Privacy Act covers the federal public sector's handling of your data. It is from 1983. So if you were even alive in 1983, you probably remember like Commodore 64. Like this was not the time of internet. So this whole thing was written before we really had internet and internet use. It is currently under review. From a provincial perspective, I don't even have a nice picture for this because it's just alphabet soup. From the provincial perspective, we have a number of public sector laws that cover all of the provinces and territories. And each of these goes into what would be schools and hospitals and any kind of public sector that is collecting information within that geographical region. We also have health legislation, which again is a bunch of alphabet soup. So if you pick any combination of H and I and A and P, you will probably end up with one of these legislations. But what these are the things that protect the health information. So we often talk about things being HIPAA compliant. HIPAA is actually the health regulation that goes with the United States. It is not relevant in Canada. Canadians have their own health legislation. As a great example here in Ontario, we have PHIPAA, which is the Personal Health Information Protection Act. I do not expect anyone to memorize these. There will not be a quiz at the end, but if you feel like looking them up, you can. PHIPAA in Ontario is very restrictive about how you have to handle data because, again, health information is highly sensitive and private information. And I'll just say here before I go on, if you do have any questions, because there's a lot of information, please throw them in the chat and I will answer them either throughout or when we get to the end, and I'm happy to do that. All right, so this is the one that we hear talked about more often. This is Pepita or Pepita or Pepita or whatever you want to call it. I have heard this pronounced every single different way, so please pronounce it however you like. But it is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. This is the law and regulation that applies to all the companies, the for-profit companies that are in Canada. So if you are working for a company in Canada or you service individuals in Canada, then you are covered under PEPITA. PEPITA has been around since 2000, so it is better than 1983, but not that much. It is based on 10 principles. And if you ever look them up, they make sense, they're good. And I said here, they're smart, but the whole thing as a whole is weak. So we have accountability in making sure that somebody in your company, there's governance, you're ensuring that there's privacy programs and policies. Identifying purposes is ensuring that you know why you are collecting the data. The consent, of course, is gathering consent from individuals before you collect this personal information from them. You're limiting to what only you require. So you're collecting only what you need. And then even once you've collected it, you're not using it all. You're only using it when you need it, disclosing it when you need it, and then only retaining it to the point that you're done with it and then getting rid of it. I will say as a sidebar, retention policy is probably one of the biggest things I see missing from most companies. Accuracy, you want to make sure that data is accurate and up to date. Imagine if you said you needed surgery on your right knee, and then your left knee was hurting when you came into the hospital, and then you said, no, I want surgery on my left knee instead, and it wasn't updated, and the surgeon did surgery on the wrong knee. So accuracy is important. Safeguards are ensuring that, of course, the data is safe from the attackers. So that's where our lovely cybersecurity comes in. Openness, ensuring that people know what you're doing with their data. Individual access, which I will get to, is the ability to request your data or have it corrected. And challenging compliance, which means if you're not doing these things, people have a right to actually report you to the privacy commissioner. So the reason why I say this is smart but weak is because when you look at those 10 principles, they make sense. They protect private data, but we don't have any fines. And because there are no fines or there are minimal fines, it's very Canadian. I always joke about it, but it's true. It's very Canadian in the sense that if something goes wrong and you complain to the privacy commissioner, then the commissioner is kind of like, excuse me, you did something wrong. And then the company's like, yeah, I don't care. And then that's it. So we don't really have a way to force companies to actually follow this, and they're not. So we have the new Bill C-11, and this is the one that was announced in November of 2020. It has 10 names. So C-11 is also known as the Digital Charter Implementation Act, and it is made up of two parts. So the first part is the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, which is CPPA, not to be confused again with California's CCPA. Again, no quiz at the end of this. And part two is the Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal Act. So this second part actually creates the legal structure in order to be able to look at what's happening that's wrong and actually being able to act legally against it. So I do have a question mark here. Is it smart and strong? I will say privacy professionals across the country, we're very much hoping that this would be our answer. We were hoping that Bill C-11 would fix all the problems we've had with PEPITA, but there are a lot of things they haven't fixed. So what I'm going to do is go over a lot of what works in PEPITA, what's coming in C-11, and what we have that could be better. So it is a legal framework, or is it? All of these regulations are legal. They come from lawyers, they come from legal institutions. They are written from the perspective of having a legal time at the top, but they all have a technical implementation at the bottom. So the problem I have with this, coming from an engineering world, is that in many companies, these legal frameworks get passed to lawyers to implement. And there are a lot of wonderful technical lawyers out there that implement this well. But there are also lawyers in there that don't understand the technical implementation behind the privacy. So the legal part gets done properly, but the technical part does not. stuck on a slide. All right. So what is compliance? If it's not legal, if it's not just a legal regulation, then what the heck is it? So as I showed you before, where we have 10 pieces to our PIPEDA, when we look at all of these compliance regulations, be it GDPR, be it the new C11, they're pretty much made up of 6 areas. And all of them cover these 6 areas to varying degrees. So the first one, like I said, is accountability and governance. That first one is ensuring that you actually have people in your company who are responsible for privacy. And again, if you make a technical product or service and your general counsel in your company or your hired legal counsel isn't technical, then you will want to work with a person or have a technical person who is also accountable. This is privacy program management. This can be done 100 different ways, but you need to make sure that you have that in place. The next part we have is data control. You have to know where your data is, how it's being accessed, and you need to be able to pull that data for individuals. So this is what I had said earlier, that you have the right to get your data, and most Canadians actually don't know this. You have the right now to go to any Canadian company and tell them you want a copy of the data that they have about you. And unless there's a couple exception reasons, they should be able to produce that data and give it to you. So you should be able to get that data. They have been doing that under GDPR. People have been doing that to companies to prove how much data they're collecting. But even now, you have the ability to actually get that data. But to do that as a company, I have to know where the data is. If you're asking me for all the data about you, I need to know where to find it. The next one is consent management. So you've probably seen a lot of things with cookies. That's a GDPR thing right now. You have to ask with cookies on whether or not you want the cookies. You have to accept them. You have to deny them. Consent management, again, is one of those things where consent needs to be given before personal information is taken. And actually, before I go on, just as a brief definition, personal information is anything that's about you, whereas personally identifiable information is something very specific to you or identifies you as an individual. So personal information about me might be my address. It could be the city I live in. It could be my gender. It could be my height. That's all information about me. But personally identifiable information would be my email address or my social insurance number. It would be anything specific to me. Combinations of things can become personally identifiable. So if you had my age, that's not identifiable, and my address is not identifiable, but my age at my address would be, because I am the only person of my age in my home. So then it becomes personally identifiable information. So with consent management, we need to make sure people understand very clearly in a privacy policy what that means, what we're taking from them, and that they have agreed to have us take that information. Also part of compliance is incident response. And a lot of people discount this, like incident response is a nice to have. Again, a lot of companies I've seen lately, they don't have an incident response plan, or if they do, they haven't actually run it. As part of your Canadian incident response plan, you should have prepared the address and the template for you to submit a breach report to the commissioners. So that would, again, it would either be for PIPEDA, it would be for the Canadian commissioner, but if it's health related, it would be to the commissioner in your province. And so it's important to understand where that's going ahead of time. You do not want to waste an hour in the middle of incident response trying to find all of that information. So having that as part of your incident response would be really, really key. And then, of course, employee training. We're going to talk about this a lot. You'll hear this in a lot of other sessions. Everyone actually needs to understand privacy. Privacy isn't just for the one privacy person that's dealing with it. Privacy is for your product managers that are designing your services and products, need to understand what they're designing for. So they need to understand the privacy that actually applies to them. The people who are answering the phone need to know, so that if somebody calls them and says, hey, I have the right to correct this, that they actually say, yeah, sure you do. And they're not sitting there going, no, we can't correct your information. You're not allowed to do that. And then, of course, privacy, like all cybersecurity, is a cost center, not a profit center. So it's very important that the C-suite understand the importance of privacy and these privacy regulations so that you can actually get the funding to put privacy into a company. And then my baby is the privacy engineering and design. I could probably, I have done entire hours on this. That is where I like to focus all the time, because if you put privacy engineering in and privacy design into what you're doing, like we talk about privacy by design or protection by design or security by design, if it's baked into what you're doing, all of this other stuff falls into place. So if you have limited the amount of data you're taking, if you've put the right safeguards in place, if you've done all of that, it becomes easier to manage, easier to pull. You're asking for less consent. You don't have that much on it. Incident response becomes easier because you're eliminating a lot of the breaches that you could have. And of course, it's easier to train your employees because you have created a privacy first product that they can then communicate to your users. So one of the big things that we're seeing in C11, which I do like, is more of this accountability and governance. So the big thing with accountability and governance is a privacy management program. And we didn't have this before in PIPEDA. It's implied, it says you should have it. It is stressed, like I said, and some of the health regulations are very rules-based. They care very, very much about that you put everything in place the right way. PIPEDA is a little more gray, so you have a little more space to manage, but it's not implied that you have this privacy management program. Going forward, if you are preparing your company for C11, you need to have a real privacy management program. And with that program, you have to have documented processes and policies. So the commissioner at any time would be able to say, I would like to see your processes and policies, and you would have to produce them. And so this is going to include access control or limited access within your company on what people can access. It also should include things like individual access to their data. So when somebody calls, what is the process for that? How do you get that data? Often when I speak to companies for the first time and I say, hey, if I'm going to call in and ask for my data, what do you do? It's an email. It's a piece of paper, a document on someone's desktop. If you're storing my personal information on a desktop about the fact that I want my personal information, you are defeating the purpose of privacy. So putting processes and policies in place to ensure that when things happen, you are still protecting privacy first is all part of this privacy management program. And then again, privacy engineering. So what does that really, really mean? So data governance is a huge part of privacy engineering. Sometimes people put data governance into the privacy program. I like to put it here because I feel like you need to do it first and then put it over into your accountability. So the very biggest thing with all of this stuff is to inventory your data. If you have done nothing ever with privacy and you are doing one thing with privacy, please inventory your data. Go through your systems and look for all of the places where you are collecting personal information. There are two types of inventory that you should be doing. There is external and internal. So what you will sometimes see is a company will inventory the data that they use for their product, which is amazing. Let's do that because that's something that we need to do. But we also have to inventory the data that we have internally. Private information that's circling around your company is just as important. I will not call out names, but I did see a data inventory recently done out of a company, and they had forms that were submitted for expenses. And in that expense form was a credit card number in full plain text on a form. And that form presumably was saved as a PDF or as a doc, and then passed from email to email to email. So looking at just that one thing. So here we have, if you were inventory your data and you said, oh, well, we have credit card numbers. Then you would go back and say, from the accountability perspective, is there a better process for this? Do we need to be collecting full credit card numbers in this document? Could we call the individual and get that credit card number over the phone and verify it? Is there some other way to collect it so it's not being transferred? Or we do need it. Is there another way to do it so that we can have it so that credit card numbers perhaps are going into a tool instead of a document, so that the tool goes directly into a secure and encrypted database and it's not going here. But you can't even do this if you do not inventory your data. So first, again, inventorying your product data or your service data, saying, what am I collecting from whom? Where am I storing it? How is it being transferred? and ensuring that you know what you're collecting, and then inventorying again your company data. Should financial data be on endpoints like laptops that belong to anyone other than the finance department? Probably not. There are a lot of tools out there right now that do this, which are wonderful, that will inventory data from endpoints, from servers, and pull what they think is PI or PII and articulate it so that you can kind of see what it is there. So that's a good way to do that. If you're inventorying your product or service, you can just do that manually on a spreadsheet. It's usually pretty easy, but the one caveat I will give you there is please don't forget about the administrator data. Everybody always forgets about the administrator. So they're like, oh, our user enters this, this, and this. And I'm like, what about your administrator's email address? If an administrator has control over highly sensitive data, their email address and their password become a highly sensitive combination. And if there's a credential stuffing attack because they've reused passwords somewhere else, your entire system could be compromised. So don't forget about your administrator data again. Quick question that came in: does British Columbia's PIPA, PIPA apply in the same way to all organizations that are subject to it? Yes, so if you are in British Columbia, then you come under PIPA, PIPA. Yeah, so it applies to all of the, again, it is for organizations that are for profit. So that one's a little bit different. We have British Columbia and Nova Scotia and Alberta have their own privacy legislations, which I did not mention, that are also private sector. So that was a really good question, because that is a private sector that comes in over PIPEDA in those 3 provinces. Okay, so from a privacy engineering perspective, again, you want to assess your data in the entire life cycle. That is not just, hey, what am I collecting? That is, what am I processing? What am I transferring? What am I storing? And then how am I retaining this? If you require, as an example, a license or a passport to verify identity, how are you collecting that? How are you transferring that safely? Because that's highly sensitive data. And then once you've actually made the authentication, can you get rid of it? So looking at that data and saying it has served its purpose and I no longer need this piece of data will very much eliminate a lot of your privacy concerns, because you are holding less sensitive data. So once you've classified all the data that you have, remove. You don't want to be holding more data than you want. Like I always joke, like if you had $50, you'd shove it in your pocket. And if you had $500, you'd probably like keep it safely in a wallet. And if you had $500,000, you're keeping that in a bank. The more that you have of value, the more you have to be careful with that thing. So the less data we can collect, especially if it's sensitive data, the better off we are. And then we hear about privacy by design. So privacy by design was originally coined by Dr. Ann Cavoukian. It is 7 principles, and it is very high level in a wonderful way that gives you a lot of structure to understand where privacy should come in. Some of the examples of what's in there are end-to-end security, ensuring your information again is private and secured in this whole data life cycle, and baked in privacy. So that your system shouldn't work without privacy. There should be no way to use your system or service and get around that privacy. That privacy should be baked into what you're doing. The privacy by design by Anne, which is, if you've never heard of it, is worth looking into, isn't necessarily practical principles. So there are all sorts of other things now. If you're looking for information, the little blue book of privacy by design is amazing, and it explains the actual practical application of privacy by design, including minimize the data, hide, abstract, and it will give you a little bit more of concrete strategic things you can do and practical things you can do to bake privacy into what you're doing. There are also a number of what we call PETs, or privacy enhancing technologies. They can be useful, but you want to make sure, like, why use a technology on something if it's not the right technology? Like, why are we trying to protect data we don't need? So again, looking at this whole data governance thing, like assessing your data and then moving that, once you've assessed it, you can move it into the category of accountability, and then looking at the privacy by design. So from a data control perspective, the individuals in Canada have rights. We have actually always had the right to access. Like I said before, if you're a Canadian, you actually have the ability to go to a company and ask them for your data. And we also have the ability to do rectification. So look at it from the perspective of there's a new allergy you want to add to a file, you should be able to go in and fix that and put it in. But it might also be something that's changed in your life. You should be able to change an address, but you are allowed to go rectify your data within a certain element. Like you can't go in and say, hey, you took notes about me in my medical file and I'd like to rectify that because I don't like it. Yeah, you're not allowed to do that. You can only rectify things that actually make sense and are factual, but you can rectify it. The two things that are being added in C11, which are both inside GDPR already, are the right to deletion and portability. So the right to deletion is the ability to ask to be removed from a system completely. If you have ever tried to remove yourself from something like Facebook, it is virtually impossible. You can deactivate accounts. Deactivating accounts are easy, but what that means is that the system holder that has all your information continues to have that information. And we don't necessarily want them to continue to have the information. So the right to deletion says, hey, there's no legal reason for you to have my info, then I want you to remove it as if I was never there. And this is like a really key thing that all regulations should have had a long time ago, but we didn't. So again, GDPR has implemented this. We are asking Canadians to do this. As a Canadian company, that means you need to know where all the data is about an individual. And that data also has to be in backups. I suspect that people are not going to pull like hard drives from their back room and stick them in and get a magnet and remove all the data off the hard drive. But technically, you should be deleting all data about an individual if they ask to be deleted. The other right that's interesting is this right to portability. And this is really coming into play now, especially that we're in this virtual COVID world. The ability of portability means that I can ask for my data in a format that allows me to transfer it from one provider to another. And because we don't yet have a universal health record that goes through everything, if I am using an online health something, let's say it's a pharmacy company and I want to go to a different pharmacy company, I should be able to request all my data from that first pharmacy company in a way that allows me to give it to the second pharmacy company. Actually, that's a great example because pharmacists themselves have a portability. You need to be able to transfer your medication and your prescriptions from one pharmacy to another. They have a format in which to do that. We're now asking from a technical perspective that companies also provide that portability for any service that they're offering. So if somebody asks you for their data, it has to be, they preferably something not machine readable, like something human readable. It can be like comma separated values. It can be something in plain language, but it has to be portable so that you can remove it and move it to somewhere else. So another question, is consent required for information that is accessible to the public? That is an awesome question. There is a set of exceptions and things around what is available and what is not. Things that are available from the public can be collected, but not necessarily processed. So fun fact, if you are collecting employee data, you're actually not legally supposed to use social networks to do that, because social networks are not a firm fixed source of data and they could change. So you're actually not supposed to use social networks, even though it's public information, to collect information about potential employees. Although I know everyone does it, but they're not supposed to. So there is a list of reasons why consent may not be required. Certainly if it's greater good, or some harm could come to someone else if it wasn't disclosed. There's a whole bunch of things, again, like accessible to public, but whether or not you can process that data just because you found it also falls kind of into a different realm, because that data is given the way the data is given. You don't know that I could write an article and it could be published publicly. It may not be fact checked. It might not be the right data. All right, so this is the big thing with C11, and this is the one slide I'm actually going to read verbatim. There is this new concept of de-identification in Bill C11. And de-identification is the ability to take away information from your data set so that individuals cannot be identified. So this is how they have defined it. So they said de-identify means to modify personal information or create information from personal information. by using technical processes to ensure that the information does not identify an individual or could not be used in reasonably foreseeable circumstances alone or in combination with other information to identify an individual. So this one statement has gotten a lot of flack from the privacy community because people don't know how to de-identify properly. And there isn't a lot of specific language around what this actually means. Like this basically just says, hey, make sure you strip stuff that identifies people and make sure they can't be re-identified. So like I said, in my home, my age wouldn't be an identifier, but it is in my house, right? So that is the in combination with other information that people often forget. So I'm going to pick on Marvel here. Marvel does a really good job, or not pick on them, they're good. They do a good job of de-identifying people. So I can't tell when someone is in costume, except that I've seen all the movies, I can't tell who they are because they have had identification stripped from them. So in this little example, the only thing I know about the Wasp is that she is a she. Otherwise, I can't even tell her height because she's shrunk. I can't tell. However, now I'm going to pick on DC. DC sucks at de-identification because in both these examples, they have taken individuals, they have changed their names, and then changed their appearances with glasses. God, glasses, always glasses. But I still know who these people are. So this is the crux of the problem with de-identification. People and companies are de-identifying data, but they are not de-identifying it to the point where it cannot be re-identified. So here are 3 problems with re-identification. The big one is combined data sets. Really easy example here is Fitbit. Fitbit had all sorts of anonymous data. It was keeping potentially GPS data. So like if you ran the same route every day, it would keep that route, but it wasn't attached to anything. It didn't matter. It was just your route and they kept it. Fine. Google bought Fitbit. And now that Google has bought Fitbit, Google has the information about who lives where you live, and it's also got the running route. So now it could combine the data and identify you with that route. Same thing could be said about a lot of companies, again, that are purchasing other companies. So if a data set is truly to be anonymized or de-identified, then it has to be done in such a way where if it's combined with another data set, that data does not become re-identifiable. The other issue is small data set sizes, which again is the example of me in my house. But looking at COVID, let's say you had a small town and you had someone who was over 90 and you like literally only had one person who was over 90 and you said one person in this town over 90 has COVID. Well, you've identified that individual. So typically age and city would not be identifiable information, but if your data set size is small enough, it could be. I see this problem all the time in companies because they use age ranges, and then often when you get up into higher ages, there are fewer people that fit that, or even lower ages, because you may not have a lot of interns or co-ops, so you may only have 2 people who are under 20. So you have to be very careful when you're trying to de-identify that the data set is actually big enough to create anonymity. And then the other thing is pseudonymization, which is fun to say and hard to spell. Pseudonymization is when there is an identifier in there that can intentionally be relinked. So that's fine as long as that relinking stays away. So if you had my personal information in one database table, and then you had a number, a unique identifier, and then in a second database table, you had that same unique identifier with a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't personal. So you're like, great, I'll just use this table because it's anonymized. The table itself is anonymized as long as you can't reconnect it with the first table. So we have to be very, very careful with how we are reconnecting it. Now we have a conundrum with our C11. And that is the data without consent. So here's where the argument comes in. You have a bunch of people saying, if we have de-identified personal data, it is no longer personal and therefore should not fall under personal data regulations. However, if it's not de-identified properly and can be re-identified, then it does fall under the regulation, but then it's not really de-identified. So we are in this whole little puzzle here where people can't really decide if de-identified data is personal data or isn't personal data. And seeing as it's currently still sitting in C11 for us, we are going to say it is personal data. And myself, because the risks are so high for re-identification, I am going to say, yes, it is personal data. As long as there is any chance in a million that that can be re-identified, it has to still be considered personal data. Because once it isn't, the C11 is saying you do not need consent to use it. So if you think you've stripped all the personal information out and you're not asking me for consent to use it, and then I am re-identified, that is going to be a problem. All right, question. In the case of WhatsApp, is there a need of balancing security to send the sender's information and their privacy if they want to link WhatsApp to Facebook? Okay, yeah. It says, what if a user doesn't consent to this? So they did consent to it, because what happened was Facebook sent out new privacy policies and said, hey, guess what? We are now taking this data from WhatsApp to Facebook. I have to be honest, given the history of Facebook, I never trusted WhatsApp to begin with. I wouldn't use it to begin with because I just assumed all the data was going back to Facebook, whether they said it was or wasn't. Facebook launched Messenger for Kids years ago. They claimed it was safe for children. They claimed it met all of this requirements. But then there was proof that came out where they were actually analyzing and using that data. So I just don't trust them because they have a history of non-trust. But in the case of WhatsApp, you had the option to continue to use the app with that knowledge or get off the app and allow Facebook to have the data. There is a fine line with all of these things. Like, I use a lot of Google products. I have actually been on Facebook for, oh God, almost 15 years, which is scary. The thing with Facebook for me, and I always say, it's like walking in a room and having like toilet paper sticking out of your pants, and it's super embarrassing. And then you take it off, and then what's been done is done. Everyone's already seen the problem. You cannot take it back. So Facebook's already got my data. They've got my data. They had my data when I joined originally and was super excited to share all sorts of personal photos I wish I'd never shared. And then they are, not only do they already have that, but they already have information about all my connections. They know the links that I used to click on. So at this point, I could leave Facebook and they would continue to have that data. Or I can stay on Facebook and now limit my use so that they can no longer collect more data. So I no longer post photos. I don't like public things. And so I'm just much more wary of how I use it. But there is that fine line. Once you've actually used a company, once you've actually used that, then it's already out there. So you just get to make a decision on whether or not it's worth the trade-off of cost to say, hey, I've already done this, so I'm just going to use it, because to me, there's groups on Facebook I can't find anywhere else. There's community groups on there that I don't have any other source for. So there's value in there for me. And again, getting off of there, although I could ask to be deleted, is pretty heinous. And as a Canadian right now, I can't be deleted. I can just be deactivated. All right, so the other thing that's coming up in C11, which GDPR has, is this automated decision system. If you are making decisions purely using AI, you have to explain that. And one of the greatest examples of this one, of course, is insurance. Insurance for years has always been, I think it's males under like 21 or always have a higher insurance premium. You can make assumptions and statistics and you can do all that stuff, but you cannot make 100% AI and computer made decisions. And if you are, it has to be in your privacy policy that is what you are doing and why you are doing it. You have to explain that. I have yet to see algorithm made without bias. That's just the world we live in right now. Algorithm is always biased. So depending on the decisions it's making, the one example I have in Canada, at least in Ontario, we have PC points, which are points that you're awarded when you go to the grocery store for buying whatever you're buying. If I go to the grocery store and I only buy junk food, and then I buy all my healthy food from like a farmer's market that's not recorded, and then a company I'm working for decides to use PC as their health insurance provider, PC could look at my purchase history and say, well, this woman only buys junk food, so we're going to rate her premiums a lot higher because we have no proof that she's doing anything healthy. That would be pure automated decision making. So if you have that kind of thing, you would have to say, when you're signing up for this, we are going to base this on your PC purchases. If you're proud of your PC purchases, that might be like a really great way to go. But if you're not, then at least you would have the ability to say, I don't like this, or I don't want this, or this is not something that I should have. Questions about employees. Okay, so employee data is not personal data. This is a whole other problem. So the new Privacy Act, C11, is the Consumer Privacy Protection Act. It is aiming for companies to protect consumers. Employee data is actually different and only protected under 3 provincial legislations. So you actually have different regulations to look at in terms of your employee personal data. And some of that is because of the obligatory need to collect data, as like, if you're part of my system, if you're part of my company, then I have to collect certain data about you. So yes, that is a good question about collecting about employees other than customers are not covered under C11. This is specifically for consumers. All right, so one of the big things that's missing from C11, and as again, a technical person, because I'm coming from the engineering side, is technical safeguards. This drives me crazy because so few people understand what they're supposed to be. There is way too little guidance on what's appropriate and what's not. There should be more specific things. So if you're listening to this and you are a cybersecurity professional, then you probably want to talk to the companies you work with about the security around their products and services. Because often vCISOs and some of the external cyber companies will come in and talk about the company's cybersecurity, but never their product and service. And then by the time I look at their product and service, it's easy things like multi-factor authentication and reCAPTCHA. There's all sorts of simple technical safeguards that should be mandated that aren't. So just knowing that they're not in there, and this is something you're actually responsible for, is determining which technical safeguards are right for you. Another thing is passwords. Passwords should always be hashed and salted. There should never be a reason to store passwords in plain text, but we're still seeing it all the time. Again, that's not specifically called out, but it should be. And then one of my sticking points all the time is information on dashboards that aren't masked. The number of times I've seen like, oh, here's all our users and their email addresses and their phone numbers. And I'm like, it should all be just-in-time data. So if you're designing a product or service that multiple people could be looking at that dashboard, you also have to keep in mind now that everyone's working from home. There are a lot of eyes on that screen. So even just masking data with little asterisks on a screen protects that private information from people who just might be walking behind the screen. But in addition to that, the person who's logging into the dashboard may not need that information. They may, and if they need to email someone, maybe you could put in a button that creates the email instead of giving that information away. So backing up and looking at your stuff, again, this is the security by design sort of stuff, is looking from those technical safeguards about what you should be putting in there. And then the last one that's not in there, which as a parent drives me nuts too, is there's no protection for kids. There's no specific regulation in Canada that protects children. In the United States, we have COPPA, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And its guidance says that children under 13 cannot have personal information gathered about them, nor can they be shown specific ads. Between 13 and 18, you can pull aggregated data, but not specific data if you're passing it off to third parties. And then over 18, then everything becomes fair game. So we don't have that. The general guidance in PIPEDA and all of these regulations in Canada is there is a 13 in there where it just kind of says, make sure you're not collecting unless you need to, but it doesn't have, we don't have our own regulation around children. So we need to be very careful. If you're designing applications for kids, you have to take special considerations. They are considered a vulnerable sector. They don't always have the technical knowledge that actually a lot of adults don't have the technical knowledge at this point either, but helping them understand what data should or should not be taken, and helping them understand, especially with passwords and things like that, and protecting that stuff. Because again, it's not specifically in any of these regulations. And so the cost of non-compliance, definitely the biggest one is reputation damage, because if you've got a breach, people will know about it. And I do focus on the breaches because frankly, if you follow all of the rules of compliance, it will limit your chances of having a breach. So if you put privacy by design and security by design into your products and services, you're limiting the private information. You're making sure that the private information that you have in your systems, including, yes, employee data, but isn't breached, you will eliminate reputation damage. So that's huge. There is the loss of business partners. So the way GDPR works right now is that the company is not compliant if their vendors are not compliant. So if you're a Canadian company that services, like you're a SaaS or something, and you service a bigger company in the EU, they can't use you if you're not GDPR compliant. So typically the same thing will end up happening with Canada. It'll get to the point where as Canadians, we won't be able to use business partners that are also not compliant. So you have to make sure that you're there. And then, yay, we have new fines. So CPPA will have fines, real fines that they can act with this tribunal that they're making. But it is up to 3% of global revenue, or 10 million. For some, or up to 5% of global revenue, and 25 million for certain offenses, which are mostly the ones where you're negligent. If there's one thing to say, hey, we tried, but we messed up, and it's a second thing to say, we didn't even try. And for those, they're going to come down a lot harder on you. If you don't have a privacy program, if you don't have stuff in place, you will get fined. So quick overview. So next steps to improve privacy. If this is you, you need to determine which legislations apply to your company and your customers. And that's both. Just because your company is in BC, if you have an Ontario customers, you are actually under all the legislations in both places. And then again, are you a public company? Are you a private company? Are you serving hospitals, which fall under the public ones? Understanding all that regulation. Beef up or implement your privacy program. Never too late. Put it in now if it's not there, or improve it if it is. Putting privacy again at the foundation of your design. I'm a broken record on this one because I could not state that one enough. Inventory your data, classify it, remove anything you do not require, and then create this data governance that actually assesses the handling of data in the entire life cycle. Equip yourself to properly handle these individual requests. So you are going to start to get them if you're not getting them already. And then if a user wants their information, how are you going to get it for them? And how are you going to, once you have it, how are you going to transfer it to them? Because that's now sensitive information. You can't just punt it in a Gmail. So how are you actually going to get them the data that they're requesting? And then examine your technical safeguards. So I don't expect anyone to actually memorize all these links, but the big one is Canadian privacy is laid out at priv.gc.ca. And within there are all sorts of links on the provincial. You can go down into the provincial weeds. You can go down to all the other ones. Every province in Canada has its own privacy commissioner, an office of the privacy commissioner. Again, it's a whole bunch of alphabet soup with an IPC and an OIPC. So if you're in a specific province, look up the privacy commissioner for that province, and you will find all sorts of guidance documents there. If you do have any questions, if you're watching this live or not live, you can fire off to me on the platform, or you can come seek me out, and I'm always happy to answer them. So we have a couple more minutes. Question, is there an obligation to monitor for breaches even if you do not suspect any? So yeah, CyberX likes to quote me on this one because I always say it's not when you're going to be breached, or you've already been breached, you just don't know it. It's true, you've probably already been breached. So you should be monitoring for breaches anyway. Canada actually changed a lot of the rules around breach notification a couple years ago. So that's already in there. Breach notification in Canada should be done as soon as possible if there's any real risk to individuals. So if you have lost, like it's an incident, right? If you have lost a hard drive and then found it again, and you're pretty sure no one opened it or looked at it, then there's very low risk to individuals. If a bunch of names got out and those names were not connected to anything that gave away private information, so good example of combined data. My name is not a private piece of information, but if there was a medical registry for, say, an illness, and all the patients' names that were associated with that registry, with that illness, were released, that becomes super sensitive private data, because it's not just my name now, it's my name with a medical condition. So that PHI, or personal health information, becomes more sensitive. So you are supposed to report breaches as soon as you know about them. Every commissioner, whether again it's provincial or federal, has a link that you can click that will give you the form that you have to fill in for breaches. It's what happened, how are you mitigating it, what are you doing to improve it, how many Canadians were affected, what's the risk. So if again, having an incident response plan, go today to find the regulations that affect you, but go today to those places and download those pages ahead of time, so that when you're in an incident, you know what you need to be recording in order to submit that information to the commissioner. There are other weird little nuanced things, again, like Ontario as an example with PHIPAA, you actually have to annually report your breaches as part of a very specific report that says how much data was lost versus stolen versus accessed accidentally. So that again is why it is overwhelming. Like, I'm not going to pretend this is easy because it's not, but in Canada, there is a lot, it's very nuanced depending on which regulation you actually fall under. So I don't know if there's any other questions. So I'm not seeing them now. So again, if you are Canadian and you have European customers, you are actually obligated to also be GDPR compliant for those customers. So all of these regulations, with the exception of CCPA, CCPA is, oh, so now I see I even keep mixing up all the initials. In California, CCPA affects California residents, but the other legislations affect both the companies that are there and the residents that are there, and they don't both have to be in the same geographical location. So both will apply. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for attending. Again, if you have any questions, come hunt me down, and I'm always happy to answer them. And good luck with your privacy and your Canadian regulations. Thanks.